Today's daf is Shabbat Kuf Lamed Vav. Today's daf is dedicated by Danielle Lisha and to the wonderful community of Daf Yomi participants at Hillel International that inspires students and staff to learn and love Talmud study. With that, we will get started. At the bottom of Kuf Lamed Hamud, we ended yesterday with this statement of Rabbanit Michelle ben Gamliel, and I want to just point out that there's a bit of confusion in this sugya in terms of what exactly Rabbanit Michelle ben Gamliel is talking about. He says that kol sheshahash 30 yom ba'adam eno nefel. Once the baby is alive for 30 days, then we know that the baby is not considered what we think is a baby that won't make it, a non-viable child. And when it comes to an animal, it's 8 days. Okay, and he proves it from pidyon haben, we do it after 30 days, and the fact that we can't bring an animal for a sacrifice until the 8th day of its life. He seems to be talking about any child and any animal. However, it's not so clear-cut, and we'll see that the Gemara later seems to indicate that he's only talking about, if you remember, we talked about that there's babies born, either 7-month babies or 9-month babies, and those are considered viable. There's 8-month babies which aren't considered viable. And some people think that what he's referring to is only babies that we don't know exactly where they are. Are they 7-month, 8th month, or 9th, right? Where they're suffix 8th month, suffix not 8th month. And then it's limited. It's not all children within the first 30 days. It's really talking about only ones that we're not really sure about their status. Now, this whole thing about, I tried to look into it a little bit more because it obviously is tricky to us how it is that the rabbis thought something, right? I mean, it's not so crazy that the rabbis thought something medically that we know not to be the case, right? Nowadays, we generally say the longer the baby's inside, the better it is. So an 8th-month baby would be more likely to survive than a 7th-month baby, even though we know 7th-month babies can also survive. So there's a bit of lack of clarity about how we deal with this, and also the fact that lahalacha now we don't hold by this 8-month thing because it seems to not be true anymore. Now, whether it was right, and whenever you have this, maybe something changed, maybe that's the way it was, or maybe they weren't, this is their approach, wasn't necessarily based on medical reality. Again, how they came up with this, it's not exactly clear. So I wanted to read to you the Rambam, because the Rambam's first of all, he says it very clearly in Hilchot Milah. Okay, the Brit Milah Halachot, Parak Aleph Halacha Yudalid. He says it very clearly. If you're 7th month, then, Nolad Shalem, this is a Vlad Shal Kayama. And Malino Tov Shabbat, you do the Brit Milah on Shabbat. But then he says, Safek Ben Shiva, Safek Ben Shmona. If you're not sure, Malino Tov Shabbat al Kol Panim. He actually says you can give it a Brit Milah on Shabbat anyway. And if it's in Ben Shmona, then, so we'll see that bit is based on something else, which we'll talk about today in the Gemara. But that's kind of, we saw yesterday that the Ben Shmona is not even considered alive. So basically says you could do a Brit Milah because it's like what we call mechatech babasal. You're not, what does it mean to make a chabura? It means to, cut someone and blood comes out of a live being. If that 8th-month baby is not going to make it, then you could do the Brit Milah because in any case, you're just cutting, it's like cutting meat, basically. It's not live. Anyway, that we'll get to in the Gemara today. You'll see where he gets that from. But what's interesting about the Rambam is, so he seems very clear, we treat 8-month baby as if it's not going to survive, 7-month baby as if it's going to survive. Then there's these suffix cases. But in Halacha Yud Gimel, before he talks about this, he says the following: Mishin olah b'chodesh hashmini. If it's born in the 8th month, which you would think he's going to say it's not considered alive, based on what he says in the subsequent halacha. It depends on how the baby looks. If the baby has, and they base it on the hair and the nails, the baby has hair and nails that look normal, then that's a vlad shalem. And then he goes to say further, what we saw yesterday about it being like a rock, and it's as if it's non-existent, right? We view it as if it's a rock, you can't carry it on Shabbat. Well, he says in this case, now he can't really say it's not a Ben Shmona. It is a Ben Shmona. He can't say the halacha about a Ben Shmona is not what we say. A Ben Shmona is considered generally like an Evan when it comes to Shabbat, can't be carried. But he says if you have a Ben Shmona that looks like a viable child that will survive because of its hair and its nails, then we just assume that it's a ben shiva that stayed in the womb a little bit longer. He redefines what it means to be ben shmona. We think ben shmona is on the clock, on the calendar. He says, no. It must be it got delayed a little. In other words, he basically says, I agree that there's this categorization, but we can put some into different categories depending on what the baby looks like. But if you see signs that this is not going to be a child that's going to survive, then hareza ben shmona vadai. Okay, okay, so basically that's what he says. And then, right, okay, fine. That's basically, I wanted to bring the Rambam and show that he starts to add in this issue. I don't know if he's the first, but he starts to talk about what the baby looks like. It's not just about on the calendar. And again, you also have to wonder, they didn't really have I'm sure they didn't keep track of things as well as maybe we do nowadays, and therefore also that could explain things. Okay, so, right, and as Carolyn points out here, that he was also a doctor, which makes it even more interesting, right? The Rambam had a lot of medical knowledge. So in any case, that's an interesting approach to it, which adds in something that makes a lot more sense to us, which is it's not just about how many months, which to us seems very strange. And the halacha, we don't hold by this 8th month. It's not a relevant factor. In halacha, today we're going to see some halachic ramifications of how we view this. So let's go back to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. He says, Kol sheshahah lamed yom ba'adam eno nefel. So again, 30 months, 30 days, it's already not considered a nefel, and 8 days for an animal. So then the Gemara asks, ha lo shahah sfeik ahave. So wait, now you're saying if you don't wait, it's a safek. Mimal hechi mahalin ale. So how can you ever give a brit milah on the 8th day if you always have to work? Now again, at this stage, it sounds like it's not 100% clear, and there's a debate among the Mefarshim, whether we're talking about a safek case or whether we're talking about a vadai, like a ben tisha or a ben shiva. Are we talking about any child, or are we talking only about ones that there's a doubt about? So it's not clear. I'm going to just say that there's 2 ways to read this whole sugya. Either which way, how do they do a brit milah if we're not sure they're going to survive? Amar le Rav Ada bar Ahava, malin otomi manavshach. We give him a brit milah because, mimanavshach means either way you look at it, it's okay. How so? Im chayhu, if he's going to survive, well then shapir kamal, then perfect. We gave a brit milah on the exact day we were supposed to. Vim lav, but if not, and this is what I quoted at the Rambam before, mechatech babasarhu. You're basically cutting something that's not alive. We said before it was like a rock. So, you're just cutting something. Making a chabua and having the blood come out isn't really real blood because it's not something that's going to survive. And therefore, it's not considered a live being. Okay, so we're going to get back to the emotional aspect of this later on in the daf. Luckily, okay, it doesn't always happen, but here the Gemara is actually going to relate to the emotional place of a parent who has a stillborn child and is in this situation. At this point, we're talking about it from a very, it's very hard to look at it because it's very unemotional. It's okay, it's just like you're cutting flesh, it's really nothing. So hold off, we'll get there. Safek ben shiva, safek ben shmona, ein mechalalim alav et Shabbat. But wait a minute. If you say that it's just mechatech bebasal, then we brought this braita that said what? A safek ben shiva, safek ben shmona, if you're not sure, ein mechalalim alav et Shabbat. You can't be mechalel Shabbat. Now, what do we assume it means you can't be mechalel Shabbat? Sounds like you can't do a brit milah. So why not? We just explained, according to Rav Barava, there's no problem. Amai. Why don't we just say the same thing we just said? Im chayu shapir kamai. If he's going to end up surviving because he was a ben shiva, then great. Im lav. And if not, if he's not going to survive, well, mechatech bebasalhu. So why don't we say that? So Amar Mar Berei de Ravina, he explains, you misunderstood the Braita. The Braita never said you do a brit milah. Notice you don't do a brit milah. It says ein mechalalim aleh et Shabbat. So what does he say? So Rav Marbury Ravina says, Anav Rav Nechumi Bar Zacharia, me and my friend, my colleague, Rav Nechumi, Targimna, we explain that Braita, Mimal Hachinami Mahalina Le, you do give the Brit Milah on Shabbat. So when it says, Ein Mechalim Alav Shabbat, what does it mean? Lo nitzrecha ela lamachshirei milah. What it means is you can't boil the water or make a fire to make the knife that we were talking about the other day. You can't do any of the preparatory work. And obviously it's only this Braita is according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you can do machshirei milah. Now we're going back to the very beginning of the parak. His approach that you can do any preparation that you need for the Brit Milah. You can't do it in a Safek ben Shiva, Safek ben Shmona. If you're not sure if the baby was born a 7th-month baby or an 8th-month baby, you're not allowed to do all the machshirei milah according to Rabbi Eliezer. According to Tanakama, you can't do them anyway. But according to, or Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, you can't do it in this case. Now, why? Why is there a difference between the Brit Milah and the machshirei milah? Not because the Brit Milah is more important than the machshirei is just preparation. It's because the Brit Milah itself is different. It's a different act that we just explained. The Brit Milah, if the baby's not considered alive, then you're just mechatech bebasar, which isn't even a malacha. But you can't say the same about building a fire. If you build a fire, you build a fire. You were mechalel Shabbat if the baby was actually going to die. So therefore, nothing else is allowed. But the Brit Milah itself, there's actually nothing wrong with. There's no isur Shabbat that you're mechalel if the baby's actually not going to survive. So now Abai says, let's go back. We started with Rav Shimon Gamliel. I just want to keep reviewing because we're going to keep going back to these things. He said 30 days is your indicator and 8 days is your indicator by an animal. Then we said Rav Ad Bar Ava, who basically says, Malimo Tomi Manafshach, right? That even though he says within the first 30 days, the baby might not survive, we don't know. Therefore, he says, it doesn't matter. We could still give him a Brit Milah because either which way we look at it, meaning the baby's considered maybe alive, maybe dead. So, they now say, Amar Abai, Kitanai, what Rav Ad Bar Ava said is actually a machloket Tanaim. Why? Let's read the following source. This is a pasuk that's talking about nevela by an animal that dies for natural causes or gets killed without a proper shchita is called a nevela. There's two relevances to that halacha. One is you can't eat it. Number two, it also carries the impurity of a nevela. Nevela, a dead animal that wasn't shechted properly, is called a nevela and has impurity, carries impurity. So, the pasuk where it talks about impurity says, if a behema, asher hi lachem la'ochla. Now, those words are not necessary, and they learn from there that it must be including another case. So, what's the other case? Lahavi ben shmona she'en shchitato mitarto. It's to teach you that not only is this animal considered a regular animal that dies is considered an nevela, but if you took an animal within the first 8 days of its life, before it was clear the animal was going to be viable, and you shecht it, okay? Now, you can't eat that animal because, we'll see, but it looks like maybe you can eat that animal because maybe the animal wouldn't have survived. But now we're going to say not only that, but the shchita doesn't take it out of being a nevela, meaning it'll still have the impurity of a nevela. Okay, it's also going to be impure. It's considered as if it died on its own, even though you slaughtered it. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon omrim shchitato mitarato. That the shchita does take it out of having tumat nevela. Okay, if you shecht it within the first 7 days, it does not have tumat nevela because you did a proper kosher shchita. So now they say, "Ma'ila b'hakam miflagei." Is this not the root of the machloket? Demar savar chayhu, umar savar metu. What did Rabbi Ad Bar Ava say? We can view if this animal, if the baby doesn't survive, we view the baby as if it was dead, right? Going back to the day you did the Brit Milah, if it doesn't survive the first 30 days, retroactively we say that the baby was never alive. If we do the same thing with shchita, we shech this animal now. Obviously, in this case, we won't be able to wait to find out what happens because we killed the animal. So we can't see would the animal survive past 8 days. But we say it's actually until the 8th day. As long as the animal survives till the 8th day, we show it survived. So now, if you say the shchita takes it out of being a nevela and it won't have the impurity of a nevela, then it shows that you view the animal as if it was alive, even though it hasn't been proven that the animal will survive. If you say, we're going to say the shchita doesn't take it out of the impurity of a nevela, and if you shech that animal before it's been proven to survive, then we're going to say you obviously view it as alive, because we're going to, as dead, because we're going to say the shchita doesn't take it out of being a nevela, and you never proved that it was alive. It's like kind of dead till proven alive or alive till proven dead. So that we assume that that's the machloket between them. But now Rava says it can't be that that's the machloket. Why? Because their machloket, as I said, nevela has two issues. One is, can you eat it? Number two is, does it have the impurity? Now this halacha is only regarding impurity. It seems like everybody agrees that shechting that animal won't allow you to eat it. So they Amar Rava ihachi ademiflagu linyan tuma v'tala liflagu linyan achila. If that's the case, they should have their machloket also about eating. And they should say, oh, it's allowed to eat. If we view the animal as alive, unless it's proven that the animal wasn't going to make it, then again, we should allow you to eat that animal if you shechted it properly. Not just it doesn't have impurity of nevela, it should be allowed to be eaten, and that's not what their machloket is about. Their machloket is only about the impurity. So therefore, he says, their machloket is not, do we view it as live until proven dead or dead until proven alive? Ella, de kule alma metu. Everybody agrees that this animal is not considered viable. Now again, it's a debate, it's unclear, and I'm just putting this out there. There's a lot of lack of clarity here. Are we only talking about an animal that's safek ben shmona, safek ben tisha, or depending on what kind of animal it is? There's different gestation periods for animals. So are we talking about an animal that we're not sure which month it was born? Or are we talking about any animal? It's not so clear. Ela dekule alma metu. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Savre, Ketrefa. Everyone thinks that this animal is not necessarily going to be viable. The question, and maybe because, maybe again, you'd have to say, maybe this is only a case when there's a suffix about its status. So Rabbi Elazar, so this group of rabbis, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon held, it's like a treifa. Now, what's the deal with the treifa? Treifa, lav, afagav de metahi, shchitatam mitarata. Hachinami loshna. We'll say the same thing we say for a treifa. What's a treifa? We generally call non-kosher meat treif, but that's not true. Not all non-kosher meat is treif. In fact, most is not forbidden because it's treif. Treifa means that there's something in the animal that's not right, sick, or some defect that makes it a treifa. When we get to chulin, we're going to learn all the simanim of treifas. But treifa, basically, the general understanding, when we get to chulin, we'll see not everybody agrees with this, but that it won't survive the next 12 months. If you shecht a treifa, now you can't eat that meat, even though it's properly shechted. However, now the animal is considered it's going to die. But if you shecht that treifa, it does not have the impurity of a dead carcass of a nevela. Okay, it doesn't have that impurity. So they say like this animal that we don't yet know, is it going to survive or not, is no different than a treifa. A treifa also, we know it's not going to survive, in fact. And yet when you slaughter it, it takes it out of this law of impurity of a carcass. So therefore, we're going to say the same thing is true for the animal that hasn't yet gotten to day number 8. So that's their approach. So meaning, again, we view it as it's going to die, but it doesn't matter that it's going to die. It still doesn't carry the impurity because it's just like a treifa. Now the rabbis, Rabbanan, lo dami le treifa. This isn't similar to a treifa. What's the big difference between this animal and a treifa? Well, treifa haitala shata kosher. Treifa generally is someone who develops a disease or something over time, meaning the animal could have been slaughtered at some point, now no longer can be slaughtered kosher shchita, because it won't allow you to eat it, but since it could have been slaughtered previously, it had a time period where it was, therefore the shchita takes it out removes the possibility of it having nevela status in terms of impurity. So basically, if you take this treifa, you can't eat it, but if you do a proper shchita, the meat won't carry impurities with it. So but this animal, lo haitala shata kosher. This never had a time period where it could have been slaughtered kosher because it never got to day number 8. So therefore, it's not the same thing. Comes the Gemara and asks, what do you mean it's not the same thing? There is a case of treifa that's just like this. Chitema treifa mi beten. The treifa could also be a birth defect where it was born already a treifa, and even though it was born a treifa, if you slaughter it, you take away the impurity. So ma'i kalamemar. The Gemara isn't bothered by that. Hatam yesh b'mina shchita, ha'che'en b'mina shchita. We go by general categories. That's in the category of treifa, and treifa in general does have shata kosher, even though sometimes it doesn't. This animal, within the first 7 days, will never have shata kosher, and therefore, if you slaughter it, it doesn't take away from its impurity. So again, we have a machloket about it. We tried to say that machloket is about, do we view it as alive or dead before day number 8, which would then be the same by humans. They say no, in the end, you can't prove either way. Okay, you could say that's the machloket, or you could say that maybe they all view the animal as dead before being proven that it can survive. And likewise with babies. So they don't really, we don't have any conclusion from here, and we don't necessarily see that what Rav Adabrava says is that theoretically, if the baby's going to die, then from the beginning it wasn't viewed as alive. Soon we're going to see what the big nafkamina is. What's the relevance, whether we view it as dead or not? We'll see. Mi plige Rabbanan alei de Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel alo. Like I said, we're going to keep going back. So we're back to now the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. He says you have to wait the 30 days or you have to wait the 8 days for the animal to know if it's alive. Again, it's not so clear. We're going to see from here that they seem to mean only in a suffix case, not in a regular birth. We don't say that, but let's see. So mi plige Rabbanan alei. So the first question is, do the rabbis disagree with him? Or is what he said agreed by everybody? Sometimes things are mentioned in one person's name and everybody agrees. Or not. Imtim salom or plige. And secondly, if we do say there's a machloket, what's the bigger question? Halacha kamoto or ein halacha kamoto? The Gemara doesn't often ask questions about halacha, but here they did. They want to know, do we paskin this way or not? So they try to bring some sources. Tashma, we're going to bring sources from animals and slaughtering animals. Egel shenolad b'yom tov, shochatino to b'yom tov. If an animal is born on Yom Tov, we can actually slaughter it on Yom Tov, okay? Even though generally you might say that's nolad, for Yom Tov purposes, it's allowed. So you can slaughter it on Yom Tov. So what does that seem to imply? This goes against what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says. He said you have to wait 8 days to see if the animal's going to survive. We just said it was obvious to everyone that less than 8 days you can't eat it. So it seems like he disagrees with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So the Gemara says, and this is where it seems clear that at least the Gemara understands that at this point, the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is only talking, what is Kalu Chodashav? Kalu Chodashav means it was a full-term baby, okay? Meaning, if the animal was born full-term, then you can shecht it right away. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was only talking about if it wasn't full-term, and we don't know how not full-term it was, right? We don't know, was it 7 or 8, or was it 8 or 9, okay? So we don't know, was it an 8th month or not? Or when an animal, depending, like I said, some animals are 5 months, the gestation period, so then it would be, I guess, 4 or 5. So they've gotten rid of that source. Tashma, let's try a second source to try to get an answer to our question. Vishavin, this is all a question, there's a machloket about, can you check a mum on an animal on Shabbat? What's the relevance of a mum if the animal has a blemish? In those days, they would bring the firstborn animal to the Kohen, and the Kohen had to bring it as a sacrifice. If the animal was blemished, then the Kohen could eat it, shecht it himself and eat it, didn't need to bring it to the temple. So now, there's a machloket, can you do it on Yom Tov or not? Because theoretically, you should have done it before Yom Tov. It's not something needed to be done on Yom Tov. So the Braita here says there, or I don't know what source, yeah, it's a Braita, I guess, or maybe a Mishnah, Vishavin she'im nolad hu v'mumo imo shezemin amuchan. If the animal was born with a mum, then you're allowed to check it on Yom Tov. It's not a problem. It's min amuchan, and it can be done on Yom Tov. So now what do you see? Why can it be done on Yom Tov? Because then you can slaughter and eat the animal on Yom Tov. But you can't eat the animal on Yom Tov if you have to wait 8 days, if the animal was just born today. So again, it's the same as last source. And again, the answer is the same. We can say that this was a full-term animal and that doesn't teach us anything. Tashma, last source, which is going to be a very clear proof. Ta'amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, this isn't a Tanaitic source they're bringing. They're bringing something Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. Halacha Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. We paskin like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. If we paskin like him, what does that infer? Halacha michlal de pligi. It must mean that they disagree. Shma mina. And this source is perfect because it answers both our questions. It answers, number one, is there a machloket? And the answer is yes. And number two, it answers, who do we hold like? And the answer is, we hold like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, so we actually do hold like him. But it seems like we're going to hold like him when it's a suffix case and not when it's a vadai case. Okay, in other words, if you know it was full term, then even under 30 days, it's considered a live child, okay, or the animal. But if it's a suffix and you're not sure, then we treat it as a suffix, right? We assume we don't know yet it's going to survive till it gets to day number 30, or for the animal, day number 8. Amar Abai. Now, we want to bring a situation that was similar. The animal, if you remember, got slaughtered and we never saw what actually happened. Did the animal survive or not? So comes Abai and he brings an example by humans like this. Nafal min agag, o achalo ari. Let's say you have this baby, and then instead of dying because it didn't make it, because it wasn't healthy, but it fell off the roof, or it got eaten by a lion. Divrei hakol chayhu. Okay, everyone agrees that in that case, we're going to treat it as if the baby was, now, Rashi says that it seems to be talking about, we're going to assume that it's bechezkat kalu lo chodoshav. Okay, that again, it's very unclear here. The Gemara didn't do a great job of telling us in each case what the situation is. Are we talking about a safek? Are we talking about a vadai ben shmona? Are we talking about a vadai ben tesha? Right? What exactly we're referring to? There's obviously a big difference. But let's assume it was a full-term baby that gets eaten by a lion within the first 30 days. Everyone agrees that that was considered a live child, even though it didn't make it to day number 30. But now he says, Ki pligi shepihek vamet. The question becomes if the baby breathed and then died. This is what we call a stillborn baby, right, or different stages where there was some sign of life and then it died. Mar savar chayhu, umar savar metu. Okay, there are some who view that animal as alive, and there's some, the baby, sorry, I keep confusing the two cases. Some who view that child as because it breathed, that means it was alive. Okay, and this is actually very interesting because when we talk about stillborn babies and parents who undergo this, right, they, sometimes people look from the side and say, why are you making such a big deal about this? And, nowadays there's so much awareness about how difficult it is for the parent and how alive that baby is for them. And this is what the Gemara is saying. That baby breathed a sign of life. That baby is considered alive. Whereas others say, no, the baby died right away. After that, that baby was never really alive. L'may nafkamina, here comes our big question. What's the halachic relevance of this? Liftor min hayibum. What does this mean? This is, okay, let's go back to what yibum means. Yibum was levirate marriage. This is when a man dies without children. His wife is supposed to marry the brother, even though it's forbidden to marry the brother. But in this case, the Torah allows it. It overrides as another case of ate ase v'dache lo tase. You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife. You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife. A man can't marry his brother's wife, even if the brother's no longer alive, unless there were no children. And then he does it. So now, did I say son? No, it's any children. He dies without any children, okay? Daughter, son, it doesn't matter. If he had a daughter, that's fine. If he had a son, it's fine. Then you don't need to do yibum. But if he died without any children, then you do yibum. Or if the brother doesn't want to, then you do chalitza. And that's what we do nowadays. Nobody does yibum anymore. We do chalitza. So there's some remnants of it in some cultures, but generally no. So now, what if this baby, he dies and the wife is pregnant, and then she gives birth to this baby who doesn't live for 30 days? Okay, so now what happened though? The baby, okay, so now we get to this case about, the question is, nafal minaga, so liftor mina yibum. If the baby breathed a sign of life and then died, do we say that baby was alive and she doesn't have to do yibum or chalitza? Or do we say no, because the baby never really lived, right? Was never considered alive. Because what happens, it's clear here. As long as he died and there was a child, if the child dies after, it doesn't matter. If the child was alive, then he left a child in the world. If the child ends up dying, okay, we don't do the mitzvah. So now, nafal min agag, o achalo ari, divrei kol chai. Oh, so sorry, before we get to that. So this is the case of pihek bamek. Do we say she's exempt from yibum or not? So now they say, wait a minute. You said a minute ago, or a few minutes to what I said before, nafal min agag o achalo ari, divrei hakol chayhu. Everyone agrees that it's alive if within the first 30 days, if something crazy happens to the baby, but not because of anything inside, internal in the baby, but something external, you're going to say that baby was never considered alive. Was considered alive for sure to everyone. Here we're going to say, but there was a story. Here's our story. Rav Papa v'Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua, iklu lebei bereid Rav Idi bar Avin. We came to the house of Rav Idi, the son of Rav Idi bar Avin. Ba'avin lehu igla tilta. Now again, we're zigzagging between animals and humans, and we're assuming whatever's true for one is true for the other, as Rabban Gamliel set up the whole thing together. They brought him an egel mashuleshet, that's always considered a nice piece of meat, b'yamama de shiva. But they prepared it on the 7th day of the animal's life, and they slaughtered it on the 7th day. The Amrele, and they said to him, if you waited till nighttime when it became 8 days old, we would have eaten it. But here we're not going to eat it. And what does that indicate? That indicates that if it was healthy, which it seems the animal was healthy, and you slaughter it, right, before the 8th day, it should be okay. If we view the baby as having gotten killed before 30 days by some external circumstance, exactly the same here. Here it got killed by shechita, and yet they didn't want to eat it. So what do they answer? So then they say, Ela kishapiek v'meit. So now they have to change what they said. It can't be that everyone agrees. Okay, in the first case, what did we say in the Abaye statement? If the baby fell off the roof, right, or a lion ate it, everyone agrees we treated that baby as if it was alive. And the debate is if it had a sign of life for a minute, right, and then died. Do we say we view that baby as having lived, or do we view that baby as never having lived for the purposes of Yibum? Now they change it, and they say because of the question that they just asked, and because of that situation where they didn't eat it, they say, no, maybe that's not the way to read it. Ella, kishapiek v'meit divrei hakol metu. When it breathed a little bit of life and then died, nobody thinks that that baby was actually alive. Or again, no one disagrees that the baby was alive, but it was never really going to make it. And therefore, it's not considered that the father had a child and the mother would have to do yibum. Ki pligi, what's the machloket? B'nafal min agag b'achalo ari. In that case, there's actually a machloket. Mar savar metu umar savar chayu. Then there's a debate within that, which is very interesting, right? If some external circumstance within the first 30 days causes the child to die, the question is, there's a debate about whether we view that animal as having lived, or maybe because it hadn't lived a full 30 days, maybe we don't view that child as having lived, which means mother would have to do yibum or chalitza. Now we're going to have our two stories, okay? And I actually think it's interesting that the Gemara brings two stories about this, which seem to be the exact same thing, and I think that they're trying to stress something important. Berei di Rav Dimi bar Yosef, Idyaleleahu Yenuka Begot Taltin Yomin. Begot Taltin Yomin Shachif. He had a baby, the son of Rav Dimi bar Yosef, had a child, and died within the first 30 days. Yativ kamit achel ilave. Kamit abel ilave. Big mistake that I made. Sorry, I didn't read it right. Yativ kamit abel ilave. He mourned for the child. Okay, this is another nafkamina of, and this is where we get into halacha l'maaseh. If you listen to Daf Michelle Farber this week, they talk a lot about halacha l'maaseh with stillborns, and that generally we say there's no avelut until 30 days. The parents don't go through the regular mourning period. There's the burial is usually done. This is something that my husband has fought for in many cases, to allow the parents to go to the burial. For years, they didn't allow parents to go to the burial, and the Chaver Kiddusha would just take the baby. They wouldn't even let the parents know whether the child was buried. And nowadays, there's been a movement to basically allow the parents, if they're interested in coming to the ceremony, in knowing where the kever is. It's changed a lot in the last number of years. So he was mitabel on the child, okay, on the baby. Interesting to see the reaction. Amar le'avua, his father says to him, and I think people can imagine this scenario. Tzvaranita kabayit lemechal, classic father here, what are you trying to do? Just you want a meal of avelut? Like, people bring you food when you're in Avel, like you're looking for the food. Like, why are you doing this? I don't understand. Why are you making such a big deal of this? You're not supposed to be mitabel here. So what does he answer? Amar le, kimle be shakalu lo chadashav. I know that this was a viable baby. This baby could have made it. And he says, right, and because of that, I'm doing avelut. Now, this is fascinating because what is he saying? So first of all, there's different ways to understand this. You could say either he really knew that it was a viable baby and something went wrong after and it didn't survive. Or what he's saying to him is, I believe, right? Like this is the classic person who's going through one of these situations. They really believe that the baby can make it. Even if, the doctors say there's no chance, they say we believe, right? And that's what he's saying. This is such a modern day, right? You read this. I think this is the way we look at it in modern day eyes. Like this is all about, the parent feels like this can really survive. And therefore he says, for me, there's avelut. And this is where we see that there's room for everything. This is what the Gemara is trying to tell us. Even though the halacha says you don't have to be mitabel, you don't need to do, but you can do it in your own way. And, he was mitabel. Okay, second story, exact same story. And that's why I think the Gemara is trying to stress that even though there's technical halacha, and even though they talk, oh, this is a mate and this is not alive, but yet they're showing the emotional side of it. Rav Ashi iklabe Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi came to the house of Rav Kahana. Itra be milta. They don't even say what it is. They say something went wrong. Okay, they don't want to say the baby died. We go taltin yoma within the first 30 days. So Rav Ashi saw that Rav Kahana was mitabel. He was going through avilut on the baby. Amarle lo sarale mar lahad amar Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel halacha Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Don't you hold by Rav Shimon ben Gamliel that again it wasn't right? What are you doing? It wasn't 30 days old. Why are you making such a big deal? To which he says, Amarle, Kimle Begavesha Kalulo Chadashav. He says the exact same thing. Right? Again, Kalulo Chadashav means he filled out his months. It means he was a full-term baby, right? That this was a baby that could have survived. And therefore he says again the same answer, which again could be understood differently, but I'm going to be mitabel on this baby. Itma. Now it was said, Met betoch shloshim, v'amda v'nit kadsha. Here's an interesting scenario. Again, try to get into the mind of this woman. The baby dies within the first 30 days, and she gets up and immediately gets married. Now, what happens? In other words, she had gotten married while the baby was still young, hadn't died yet. She went and got married, meaning, okay, what are we talking about? We're obviously going back to the Yibum case. She didn't wait to see, will the baby survive 30 days? Her husband obviously died while she was pregnant. She was looking around for a husband. She now has a new baby. She needs to take care of the baby. She needs financial means often in those days. Marriage was also for financial purposes. She gets married to someone right away so she can help deal with it. And then the baby dies. So now what's the problem? The problem is, again, if we view the baby as alive, then it's fine. But if we view the baby as dead, then she needs to do chalitza, but now she's already married. So it's kind of complicated. So Amar Ravina Mishmei de Rava, Im Eshet Yisrael hi choletzet. If she's married to a Yisrael, we make her do chalitza because it doesn't really matter. She could do chalitza and then be married to this person. So she undergoes chalitza so that since now she's obligated in chalitza and she wasn't before, we make her go through it. But in Eshet Kohen, now the Gemara, this is one of those classic cases of sensitivity of halacha and finding an answer when there's a need. So if she's married to a Kohen, what's the problem? Chalitza is considered like a divorce. Like a type of divorce, and the rabbis, it's not by Torah law, but the rabbis forbade a chalutza, someone who underwent chalitza, to marry a Kohen, because it's basically like someone saying, I don't want to marry you. It's similar to divorce, and they don't allow her to marry a Kohen. So if she's married, if the person she got married to in the interim was a Kohen, if we make her do chalitza, she's going to have to get divorced from her husband. So the rabbis didn't want to do that, so they said, then we're going to say, so what are they doing basically? They're saying that since there's a debate, do we view this child as having been alive or do we view the child as never having been alive? When we have a need, we can side with saying that we'll view the child as if it was alive in order to prevent her, right, to prevent this difficult situation of making her get divorced from her husband. But Rav Shrevia, Mishmei de Rava, says, Amar, okay, now notice, Ravina said it in the name of Rava. Now Rav Shrevia comes and says it in the name of Rava. Amar achat zo ve'achat zo choletzet. Either which way she has to do chalitza. There's no way out. Okay, so they both quote Rava. So comes Ravina and he says to Rav Shrevia, Amar le Ravina le Rav Shrevia, be'ortam Rava hachi litzafra hadrabe. What you're quoting in the name of Rava was what Rava said at nighttime. But in the morning, now I don't know if it literally means night and morning, but what he basically says is, I was with Rava and he changed his mind. So originally he thought to go that way, and over time he changed his mind, and you're wrong. Well, Rosh Hashanah didn't really like to hear that. And Amarle, Shrituha, you want to matir this woman to allow her to be married to this Kohen and not make her do chalitza? Here he goes off, Yehei Rava de Tishru Tarba. I bless you or curse you that you're going to end up being matir chelev. You're going to allow people to eat the forbidden fats that are clearly doraita. In other words, you're basically taking this halacha. She has to do chalitza. What are you talking about? You're basically overriding the Torah. How could you do this? Okay, so he was very strong about it. You see, the Ravina was pretty strong about his opinion also, about making room for this woman to not make her suffer any more than she already suffered, right? Bad enough her husband died. Now she has this baby who died, and now you're going to make her get divorced from her husband, right? So interesting of the two approaches here. Okay, that's the end of that whole topic, okay, which, as I said, was a heavy topic, but what I like about it is that the Gemara first talks about it in very technical terms. In fact, yesterday's Gemara was really troublesome about, this baby is a rock and you can't move it on Shabbat and the mother has to bend over to nurse it and, but then it seems to come around to, yes, that's the dry halacha, but there's more to it than that, and there's the emotional side of things, and there's suffix cases, and there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And as I said, the Rambam, who kind of takes it out of this dry 8 months, 7 months, 9 months, whether that, into saying it depends what it looks like and what the scenario is. Okay, the last part for today is this androgynous case. So we had in the Mishnah about the androgynous who has both genitalia of male and female, and it said that Tanakama says you can't give him a Brit Milah on Shabbat because he's a suffix case, and Rabbi Yehuda matir ba'androgynous. So now we're going to say Rav Amar, Rav Shizbi, Amar, Rav Chisda, lo lekol amar Rabbi Yehuda androgynous sacharhu. Just beware. He said he treats the androgynous like a male, like a definite male in terms of Brit Milah, but he doesn't say this across the board. How do I know? He doesn't think that in every area of halacha, androgynous is treated like a definite zachar. We need a little background before we go on, which is laws of erchin. Okay, if you learn Masechet Erchin, there's a whole Masechet about this, which is that people are valued. If you say, I'm giving the value of a person to the temple, you can say that, and there's a set amount in the Torah that you have to bring. Depends if you're a male or a female. It depends what age range you are. And it all has to do with, it's one of those sugyas about men are worth more than women, but it all has to do with the work, the way the shuk worked in the work market. That a man was worth a lot more money than a woman because the man did all the hard labor and therefore he could work harder than the women, so they were valued at more. So it's basically the value in the shuk, and that's why men who are little or older and can't work anymore are worth less. So that's how we understand that. Anyway, you're worth a different value. So it says im zachar and im nikeva, if you're male, if you're female. So comes the Gemara and they say, here's a braita. Okay, so first Rav Chisda says, he doesn't say, Lola kolamar Rabbi Yehuda androgynous sacharu, she'im ata omerkin, because if you say so, be'erchin yarech, if we treat androgynous as a zachar, then he should have a value. And we're going to learn now that if you give the value of an androgynous to the Beit HaMikdash, androgynous, you basically promise nothing, because an androgynous doesn't have a clear value from the Torah. Okay, because he's not necessarily zachar and he's not necessarily nikeva. We don't know what he is. And it's when you give a value, you give a definitive value. You say, when you said I'm giving something, it has to be you're giving something definitive. And that's not definitive, so you don't have to give erchin. And we're going to quote this braita that they're going to say must be in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. And it says here that androgynous doesn't give value. So it's clear that Rabbi Yehuda in this case doesn't think that androgynous is definitely zachar. So minal and delo me'arei, how do we know this? Titania, it says in the following, braita, hazachar, okay, that's what it says there. It says, v'haya erkecha hazachar, the value of the zachar. So they say, what does it mean, the zachar? Why didn't it just say zachar? It teaches you below tumtum v'androgynous. Not a tumtum, which is someone whose genitalia is covered and you can't tell if they're male or female, or not an androgynous who's both. Yacholo yehe be'erechish, so fine. From hazachar, we say you're not going to have to pay the full value of the man. Aval yehe be'erechisha, maybe you'd have to pay, it's either male or female, so if we're not going to make you pay the male value, maybe you should pay the female value. But no, because it says in the pasuk, hazachar, and then it says, im nikevahi. If it's nikevahi, and those words are also a little unnecessary. When we get to Erchin, we'll see all those, why they all think this is all unnecessary. Right now, we're just quoting this. Zachar vadai, nikeva vadait. So they darshan from those words, ve'im nikevahi. If it's female, that comes to teach you it has to be. Hazachar means definitely male, and im nikevahi means definitely female. So, velo tumtum v'androgynous, and neither of those, right? Not the tumtum, not the androgynous. And what does this have to do with Rabbi Yehuda? How do we know that Rabbi Yehuda holds this? Because this is what we call a midrash halacha, called the Safra. It's a midrash halacha in Sefer Vayikra, the Stam Safra Rabbi Yehuda. And we have a tradition. We normally say Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, a Stam Safra is Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, we assume the author of this is Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Yehuda's position. So we see that even though he said androgynous is vadai zachar when it comes to Brit Milah, he doesn't necessarily say so when it comes to other things, and particularly Erchin is our proof of where he doesn't say it. Tomorrow we'll finish up with one little section before we get to the next mission. That's it for today, and have a good day, everybody.